The night when money met the Frere 3,500 characters. The story you are about to hear is not about ideology. It's not even about politics. It's about money, the kind of money that can turn an angry street agitator into the most dangerous man in Europe. Late 1932. Berlin is tense like a clenched fist. Elections are coming, and Hitler is still, in the eyes of big business, a loud outsider, a man with wild eyes, impossible promises, and a fanatical hatred of Jews and capitalism itself. Industrial giants whisper, "This man, hell ruin us." And yet behind closed doors, a different story is unfolding. Just days before the Reichstag elections, Hermann Göring invites 25 of Germany's most powerful industrialists to a secret meeting in his luxurious Berlin apartment. A quiet, upscale building, but inside, history is shifting like plates beneath the earth. The plan is simple. Let Hitler speak. Let him explain his economic vision. Let the businessmen decide whether this Austrian firebrand deserves a single mark. Spoiler: they gave him more than 2 million. But that outcome was anything but guaranteed. When the businessmen arrive, they are confused, skeptical, even disgusted. The Nazi press screams against big capital. Hitler's rhetoric sounds insane to many of them. And yet they still come, partly out of curiosity, partly out of fear, and partly because one man keeps insisting. Emil Kurdorf. A coal tycoon. A true believer. A man who didn't just admire Hitler, he evangelized him. Kurdorf had money, connections, and influence. And he used all of it to give the Nazis a chance to speak directly to the economic elite. But the real magic of that night wasn't Kurdorf. It was the speech. Hitler doesn't talk about taxes, or trade, or wages. He doesn't mention the economy at all. For a full hour and a half, he talks about something else: a fear. He warns them. If the Nazis lose, Germany will fall into civil war. Communists will seize power. Factories will burn. Their wealth, their companies, their families, everything will disappear. He doesn't ask them to invest. He forces them to choose a side. By the end of the speech, the room has changed. The industrialists arrived thinking they were evaluating Hitler. But Hitler made it clear. He was evaluating them. And they blinked first. They wrote checks that night, enormous checks. Enough to flood Germany with Nazi propaganda. Enough to fuel one of the most aggressive election campaigns Europe had ever seen. Enough to tip the scale toward darkness. But here's the twist that almost no one knew at the time. This wasn't the beginning. Behind the scenes, another man was already building bridges between Nazism and capital quietly, strategically, and with astonishing efficiency. His name was Wilhelm Kepler, a small-town chemist who became one of Hitler's most influential economic advisors. Kepler didn't look like a kingmaker, but he created something that would become the financial engine of the Third Reich, a private circle of businessmen, donors, and loyalists. Later, it would earn a chilling nickname: the Friends of Himmler. A club of 40 men, bankers, factory owners, industrial magnates, each one powerful enough to shift entire sectors of the German economy. They weren't Nazi fanatics. Most weren't even ideologues. They simply saw opportunity, influence, protection. And Himmler saw something too. Money meant power. Power meant loyalty. Loyalty meant fear. This unholy alliance of industry and SSWASNT, born in smoke-filled bars or political rallies. It began in quiet apartments, in whispered meetings, in handshakes forged not from trust, but from mutual need. It began with men who looked at Hitler and thought, "We can control him." They were wrong. The night the doors closed, Germany, 1931. A nation drowning in unemployment, humiliation, inflation, and fear. But fear is a currency, and Adolf Hitler was learning to spend it with terrifying precision. On a cold Berlin evening, behind the thick curtains of Hermann Göring's apartment, something happened that would change the fate of the world. Hitler and the Nazi leadership gathered 25 of the most powerful industrialists in Germany, men who owned steel, coal, chemicals, banks, factories, and the future itself. The meeting was meant to be private, secret, off the record, and for a good reason. Because this was the night when the Nazis attempted something bolder than any street rally or beer hall speech: to buy the keys to Germany's economy. What pushed the industrial barons to even listen? Fear. The fear of communism, the chaos of strikes, and the memory of the 1918 revolution, in which businessmen were dragged from their homes, something the file describes vividly. The violence of the revolution and the terror it inspired in men like Fritz Thyssen to When these magnates stepped into Gring's living room that evening, they expected a dull explanation of party economics as something safe, something boring. Instead, Hitler launched into a fiery speech lasting more than 2 hours. Not plans. Not numbers. Threats. He warned them that if the Nazis did not win, Germany would plunge into civil war, a point mentioned directly in the file about Hitler's forceful warnings to industrialists too. Most of these men hated extremism of any kind. Many still mocked the Nazis as a fringe movement, as the file notes about big business distrusting Hitler's early anti-capitalist rhetoric and anti-Semitic frenzy too. But as the speech went on, something shifted. Hitler wasn't begging for support. He was offering survival. Behind him stood Gring. Beside him stood the rising persuaders, men like Wilhelm Kepler, who would soon organize a circle of friends, a private club of financiers aligned with the SS, exactly as the file describes too. And in the audience sat giants. Gustav Krupp, Fritz Thyssen, Emil Georg von Stoss, men who commanded empires of steel and coal. The file mentions it clearly. Von Stoss would soon become a key financial conduit to the Nazi Party, linking Hitler to the highest levels of banking power too. By the end of the night, the impossible happened. The businessmen didn't walk out. They wrote checks. More than 2 million marks were handed to the Nazis, enough, as the file explicitly states, to secure a parliamentary majority and then a dictatorship too. Think about that. A handful of frightened millionaires, in a single evening, accidentally helped fund the collapse of their own democracy. But the truth is even darker. Some of these men believed Hitler would be their puppet, a detail your file highlights. Industrialists thought they could use the young politician for their own goals, imagining him as a convenient marionette they would control too. They had no idea that Hitler was the one pulling their strings. As the businessmen left the apartment that night, Berlin's winter wind swept across the street. They had bought themselves safety, or so they thought. What they truly purchased was something else. The most destructive political project of the 20th century. And this was only the beginning. Because the deeper the Nazis pushed into the world of money and corporate networks, the faster they transformed from a marginal party into a machine fueled by steel, coal, chemicals, and fear. The day business knocked on Hitler's door in the final days before the Reichstag election, Berlin was buzzing with a very strange kind of anticipation. Whispers moved faster than newspapers. Hitler is meeting the industrialists. Tonight. In total secrecy. For years, Germany's big business looked at the Nazi Party the way you look at a stray dog barking under your window, noisy, annoying, and definitely not something you invite inside. Their newspapers were full of anti-capitalist slogans, their speeches dripped with hatred toward bankers and industrial giants. But 1932 was a different world. Germany was collapsing, factories closing, billionaires losing empires overnight, and fear, real, physical fear, spread through every boardroom in Berlin. That was the night Hermann Göring gathered 25 of the most powerful industrial titans in his luxurious Berlin apartment. The guest list was astonishing. Bankers, steel magnates, chemical barons, the people who literally built German industry with their bare hands and enormous capital. Officially, they were invited to hear Hitler explain his program. Unofficially, everyone in the room knew they were about to be asked for money. A lot of money. At the center of the room stood Gustav Krupp, head of the ancient Krupp dynasty, rulers of Europe's largest industrial empire. He didn't come as a supporter. He came to deliver a warning from big business. We do not trust your party. But what happened next changed the course of world history. Hitler didn't speak about taxes, or economic reforms, or trade. For 90 unbroken minutes, he launched into a fiery monologue. He promised a new Germany of powerful, unified, protected from the Red Plague. He painted the communists as an incoming tidal wave ready to seize factories, burn estates, and execute industrialists as class enemies. Then came the line that froze the room. If we lose this election, Germany will descend into civil war. Not a prediction, a threat. The businessmen were stunned. Hitler didn't offer them stability. He offered dominance and implied chaos if they refused. Fear did what ideology never could. By the end of that night, checks were already being written. Over 2 million marks flowed into Nazi accounts. Enough to fuel a propaganda machine powerful enough to win a national majority. Enough to open the road to dictatorship. But why didn't anyone simply tell him no? Because the industrial elite had started to believe a very dangerous illusion. They thought they could control him. To them, Hitler was a tool to loud, energetic populace they could puppeteer from behind the curtain. A battering ram to smash communism, after which he would quietly step aside. They could not have been more wrong. In the months that followed, pro-Nazi industrial groups began forming everywhere. One of the most influential gathered around Wilhelm Kepler, a small-town chemical factory manager who would soon become Hitler's key economic advisor. His circle of friends wasn't just a club. It was a pipeline of funneling money, influence, and legitimacy straight into the heart of the Nazi movement. Historians later wrote that this was the moment Hitler's rise became unstoppable. Not because businessmen loved him, but because they feared the alternative more. And fear is the most expensive currency in politics. The night the industrial elite learned fear, it began behind closed doors, in a Berlin apartment that smelled of cigar smoke, polished wood, and quiet panic. A few hours before the Reichstag elections, Hermann Göring hosted a meeting so secret that even the guests were unsure why they were truly invited. 25 of Germany's most powerful industrialists entered that room believing they were simply there to hear Hitler's program. They did not yet understand that history had brought them to a crossroads and that this night would decide far more than just campaign funding. Hitler arrived without a smile, without small talk, and without any of the typical political flattery. Instead, he spoke for 90 uninterrupted minutes, not about taxes, not about trade, not about industry. He spoke about fear, about chaos, about the red wave that would drown Germany if he lost. And then, in a voice that slowly tightened around the room like a wire around a throat, he made his promise. If he was denied power, Germany would not see peace again. By the end of the speech, even the most skeptical magnates understood the message. They were being given a choice of support Hitler or face civil war. The effect was immediate. The businessmen, who only hours earlier viewed the Nazis as a loud fringe movement, now pulled out their checkbooks. In a single evening, the Nazi Party raised more than 2 million marks, enough to secure not only the election victory, but the political machinery that would dismantle the Republic from the inside. And yet the question remained. Why didn't these titans of steel, coal, and chemicals simply say no? Why not reject a man whose speeches were filled with threats and hysteria? There is an explanation, unsettling, but deeply human. Gustav Krupp himself attended the meeting to voice the concerns of German industry. He planned to warn Hitler against radicalism, against anti-Semitism, against his attacks on capitalism. But Hitler's performance that night shattered his resolve. As witnesses later recalled, Krupp sat frozen, stunned by the force of Hitler's rhetoric and by the fear that refusing him might unleash exactly the violence the Nazis predicted. The business elite believed they were buying stability. In reality, they were financing their own destruction. What none of them knew was that Hitler had already begun building networks inside their world. One of the key architects was Wilhelm Kepler, a modest chemist from the small town of Eberbach, a man who rose from obscurity to become one of Hitler's closest economic advisors. He founded exclusive circles of wealthy supporters. First the Economic Friends Circle, later the notorious Circle of Friends of the REICHSFHRERSS, a group of financiers who would become Heinrich Himmler's private economic engine. These were not fringe figures. They were the CEOs, bankers, and corporate strategists of Germany, and whose signatures could move markets and build industries overnight. And yet, behind the polished doors of their boardrooms, they were quietly aligning themselves with a movement that promised them protection, influence, and a stake in a future built on authoritarian power. Klaus Drabisch, a scholar who studied these networks, wrote decades later, Himmler needed the backing of economic circles to expand his own power, and they saw advantages in backing him. It was a mutual seduction. Industry sought stability, the Nazis sought legitimacy. Both believed they could control the other. But history would prove only one side was right. And this is where the tragedy of the German elite begins, not with ideology, but with fear. They thought they were buying protection. What they actually bought was the end of the world they understood. The men who bankrolled the monster, they thought they were buying influence. They thought they were buying stability. What they were really buying was their own destruction. By the early 1930s, a quiet, uncomfortable truth was forming behind closed doors in Europe and across the Atlantic. Adolf Hitler was no longer just a loud extremist with a talent for rabble-rousing. He was becoming a political asset, as someone powerful men believed they could use for their own purposes. And among those early believers were not only German industrial tycoons, but businessmen from America as well. It all begins with a man named Kurtildek, an enthusiastic supporter of Hitler long before the world knew the name. Uldek traveled Europe and the United States, meeting wealthy patrons and whispering the same seductive pitch everywhere he went. Support Hitler now, and you will shape the new Germany. One of the figures Lech is believed to have courted was the legendary American industrialist Henry Ford. In the United States of the 1920s, Ford wasn't merely a businessman, he was a cultural icon, a man whose name carried the same weight that tech visionaries carry today. Yet behind the iconic image lay a darker, sharper worldview. His writings and public statements revealed a man with dangerously rigid beliefs that resonated disturbingly well with the rising German extremist movement. By the early 1930s, Ford's interests in Germany had grown dramatically. He opened a major factory in Cologne and personally attended the groundbreaking ceremony, a gesture that sent ripples across the Atlantic. Rumors spread quickly. Had Ford met with Hitler? Was he secretly funding the Nazi Party? No one could prove it then, but the whispers sounded all too plausible. When American troops landed in Europe years later, many were stunned. German military trucks, staff cars, and transport vehicles bore names they recognized all too well. Ford and Opel, the latter owned entirely by another American titan, General Motors. The machines driving Hitler's war machine were built by companies from the very country that would soon fight him. And Ford was hardly alone. Across the Atlantic, in Germany itself, powerful industrial families were making decisions that would reshape history. Some, like Flick, used concentration camp slave labor long before the full scale of the Nazi regime was clear. Others, like Tyson, believed they had found in Hitler a convenient puppet, someone who could smash the communists, crush the unions, and restore order while politely stepping aside for the industrial elite afterward. But puppets have a way of cutting their own strings. One by one, these titans discovered that Hitler had no intention of being controlled. He broke promises, seized industries, replaced boardrooms with loyalists, and fed the nation's wealth directly into the machinery of the Third Reich. Some collaborators fled. Some stayed and prospered. Others faced tribunals after the war, though the punishments were often shockingly mild, mere symbolic gestures in the face of unimaginable crimes. And yet, the core tragedy remained unchanged. Without their money, Hitler's rise would have been impossible. Businessmen thought they were funding a politician. What they actually funded was the storm. And as we move deeper into this story, the question becomes unavoidable. Did they simply misjudge a radical? Or did they unleash something they quietly hoped for, the force that would crush their enemies, protect their wealth, and remake the world in their image? In the next chapter, we step into the inner circle itself, where those wealthy friends forge a secret alliance with the darkest institutions of the Third Reich, believing, fatally, that power could be shared with a monster. Ford and America. Friendship across the ocean. In the America of the 1920s and early 1930s, Henry Ford wasn't just a businessman, he was a legend. A symbol of ingenuity, efficiency, and the promise of a modern industrial world. His factories thundered like mechanical cathedrals, his ideas reshaped global labor, and his name became synonymous with progress itself. But behind this shining public image lived a man driven by convictions far darker than most Americans realized at the time. Ford was a brilliant engineer and a deeply ideological figure. His newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, didn't just promote industry or innovation, it became a megaphone for his fierce anti-Semitic beliefs. He published a series of inflammatory essays, including the notorious text known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a forgery he nevertheless treated as gospel truth. And because Henry Ford wasn't a fringe extremist but one of the wealthiest, most respected businessmen in the United States, his words carried dangerous weight. They traveled across oceans, newspapers, political circles, and eventually reached a rising politician in Germany who devoured every line. Adolf Hitler admired Ford so much that he kept a portrait of him in his office. In Mein Kampf, Ford is the only American praised by name, the only foreigner Hitler saw as an ideological ally. And as the Nazi movement grew, rumors began spreading in the U.S. Ford wasn't just admired by the Germans, he was helping them. When Ford failed to acquire Opel in the late 1920s, General Motors succeeded instead. But Ford didn't give up on Germany. In 1931, he opened his own factory in Cologne and traveled there personally for the inauguration. The moment was symbolic. An American industrial titan shaking hands with the rising stars of the new German political order. American newspapers buzzed with speculation. Had Ford met Hitler privately? Was he quietly financing the movement? No hard proof ever surfaced, but the circumstantial evidence piled up. Ford Motor Company's German operations expanded rapidly. As Hitler came to power, Ford's local branch adapted with alarming speed. By the late 1930s, Ford's business interests were deeply intertwined with the new regime. In 1938, the Nazi government awarded Henry Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor Germany could give a foreign civilian. Pictures of Ford receiving the medal circulated worldwide. In the US, the reaction was a mix of shock, admiration, and unease. Then came the war. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Ford factories in Germany kept running. By the early 1940s, 70% of the German automotive market was controlled by American companies, Ford and General Motors. Their factories switched to producing military vehicles for the Wehrmacht. When U.S. soldiers eventually landed in Normandy in 1944, they were stunned to see trucks, staff cars, and engines built by Ford and Opel powering the enemy's advance. Was Henry Ford personally directing this? Most historians say no. By that time, Ford was elderly and increasingly detached from daily operations. But his earlier decisions, his ideology, his admiration, his investments had already set the course. His factories, his influence, his reputation became part of the vast industrial machine that prepared Germany for war. And behind closed doors in Washington, politicians whispered an uncomfortable truth. One of America's greatest innovators had also become, willingly or not, one of Nazi Germany's most useful friends. Circles of power. From the Industrial Club to the Brown House, the early 1930s in Germany were years of chaos, collapsing banks, street battles, political paralysis. But behind the public turmoil, a quieter drama was unfolding in conference halls, private clubs, and lavish hotel salons. It was here, far from the shouting crowds, that Adolf Hitler fought his most important battles, not with bullets or fists, but with words. And the audience wasn't desperate workers or angry veterans. It was Germany's industrial elite. For years, big business had treated Hitler as a fringe agitator, too radical, too unpredictable, too vulgar. But something was changing. The Great Depression had crippled Germany's economy. Fear of communism spread like wildfire. And many industrialists, once skeptical, now wondered, could this fiery Austrian actually restore order? The turning point arrived on a winter evening in January 1932. Fritz Thyssen, the steel magnate who had quietly supported Hitler for years, orchestrated an extraordinary event, a private lecture at the prestigious Seldorf Industry Club. This was no ordinary institution. These were the men who controlled coal, steel, chemicals, railroads, the economic backbone of the nation. A single speech here could unlock fortunes. Originally, the guest speaker was supposed to be a more moderate Nazi, Gregor Strasser. But Hitler intercepted the opportunity. When he learned of the meeting, he demanded to appear in person. Thyssen agreed. And so, on that cold January evening, the industrial giants of Germany gathered inside a fortress-like luxury hotel while outside crowds of anti-fascist protesters chanted and clashed with police. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The attendees expected to hear another populist rant, something beneath the dignity of their polished suits and gold tie pins. And indeed, the first minutes of Hitler's speech were met with icy silence. But then something shifted. Hitler abandoned the usual party slogans. Instead, he delivered a calculated, strategic argument tailored exactly to his audience. He spoke of national revival, of stability, of crushing communism before it devoured Germany. He promised that under his leadership, the state would become a shield of protecting property, protecting capital, and giving industry the freedom to thrive. He didn't talk policy. He talked destiny. Germany's destiny and theirs. Slowly, the room changed. Men who had arrived with crossed arms now leaned forward. Their faces reddened with excitement, their eyes fixed on Hitler, as if mesmerized. By the time he finished, after nearly 2 uninterrupted hours, the applause was explosive. Hitler had won not just their attention, but their wallets. This moment would later be remembered as the Seldorf speech, one of the most important in Nazi history, not because of its content, but because of its audience. That night, industrialists who had hesitated for years finally concluded, "This man is useful, maybe even necessary." Behind the scenes, Hermann Göring capitalized on the breakthrough. He hosted private meetings in his lavish Berlin apartment, greeting magnates with cigars and quiet assurances. Support Hitler, and your interests will be protected. His home became a revolving door of steel barons, bankers, chemical tycoons, aristocrats, all eager to negotiate influence before the Nazis rose to full power. Those gatherings were nothing like the feverish rallies in Munich. No banners, no shouting, just polished wood tables, thick carpets, and deals sealed with handshakes. It was in these quiet rooms, not in the streets, that Hitler's political machine found its true fuel. Soon, party headquarters expanded, propaganda intensified, new offices opened across Germany. Money was flowing, and with it came momentum. What had once been a fringe movement was now being sculpted into a national force, financed by the very people who believed they would control it. They imagined Hitler as a tool of a puppet who would stabilize the Republic, crush the left, and then politely step aside. Instead, they had just handed him the keys to the country. The Himmler Circle, corporate power, and the shadow network. By the late 1920s, the Nazi movement had two faces. One noisy, public, marching in the streets. The other quiet, calculating, operating behind velvet curtains and mahogany doors. And at the center of this second world stood Heinrich Himmler, a man who understood something crucial. Ideology wins crowds, but power is built through alliances. Himmler didn't have the charisma of Hitler or the flamboyance of Göring. He was reserved, meticulous, almost bureaucratic. But what he lacked in showmanship, he compensated with an uncanny talent for building networks. And the most important of these networks would become known as the Circle of Friends of the REICHSFHRERSS, a private club where Germany's most influential businessmen met the man who controlled the secret police. The origins of this circle were surprisingly modest. It began with Wilhelm Kepler, an unassuming chemical industry manager who joined the Nazi Party early and believed that industry must be woven into its rise. Kepler started inviting sympathetic entrepreneurs to dinner. Small gatherings at first, just a few men in tailored suits discussing politics over coffee and cigarettes. But the idea caught on. Businessmen loved the access. Kepler loved the influence. And soon, these informal meetings evolved into a tightly knit, carefully curated circle. Membership wasn't open. To enter, you needed recommendations, background checks, and above all, ideological loyalty. Many applicants were rejected. The SS didn't simply want money, it wanted alignment. Once accepted, though, you were no longer just a businessman. You were part of the Reichsführer's personal power network. For industry, the benefits were immense. The SS offered something that every major corporation wanted in a time of political chaos: protection. When factory strikes broke out, SS officers could restore order. When rivals made accusations, the Gestapo could suddenly appear at their doors. When businessmen wanted territorial expansion, the SS could influence regional governors or party officials. It was corruption, but wrapped in the rigid discipline and cold efficiency of the black uniformed elite. For Himmler, the gains were even greater. This circle transformed him from a fanatic with a paramilitary unit into one of the most powerful men in Germany. With every donation, with every handshake at a private salon in Bavaria or Berlin, he gained something more valuable than moneyed legitimacy. Industrial giants treated him as an equal, even a partner. And this partnership gave the SS the financial oxygen it needed to grow. The meetings themselves were strangely intimate. Survivors later described long tables in manor houses, low light, thick smoke, polished silverware. Men with impeccable manners passing sealed folders across a table while SS officers stood silently in the shadows. There was no shouting, no threats. The danger was implied, woven into every polite exchange. In return for their loyalty, members of the circle gained unparalleled access to the highest levels of power. They weren't merely financing the regime, they were shaping it. They influenced economic policy, labor laws, industrial expansion, all while convincing themselves they were protecting Germany from chaos, communism, collapse. Some industrialists saw the SS as a necessary evil. Others disturbingly embraced it. They admired its discipline, its efficiency, its ruthless clarity. And as the circle expanded from a handful of men to nearly 40, its influence became extraordinary. Decisions that affected millions of lives were whispered over crystal glasses and oak tables. The irony, of course, is that many believed they were manipulating Himmler, that they were buying influence, securing their empires, hedging their bets. But the truth was the opposite. With each secret donation, the SS tightened its grip not only on the state, but on the businessmen themselves. They had stepped into a game where every move pulled them deeper, where every favor came with a hook attached. They thought they were supporting a political party. In reality, they were helping build a machinery of terror that would soon engulf all of Europe. From meetings to money, The secret session of 1933. By the start of 1933, Germany was standing on the edge of a cliff. Elections loomed, violence escalated, and the political landscape was splintering. Hitler's movement was powerful, but financially exhausted. His rallies were expensive, his propaganda machinery devoured cash, and his party organization strained under growing debt. Without a sudden influx of money, the Nazi rise could stall precisely at the moment they were closest to power. That's when Hermann Göring made his move. Göring wasn't just a party leader, he was the social bridge between the rough, militant world of Nazi politics and the polished, aristocratic realm of German corporate elites. His Berlin apartment became the ultimate backstage. Velvet curtains, exotic hunting trophies, expensive cigars, and discreet servants. It was a stage perfectly designed for persuasion. Here, businessmen could feel entertained, flattered, and ultimately recruited. And so, on a cold evening in early 1933, 25 of Germany's most influential industrialists quietly entered that apartment. CEOs, steel magnates, chemical barons, and men who shaped the German economy. They did not come because they admired Hitler. They came because Göring promised answers to the question haunting every boardroom. What happens if Germany falls to communism? When Hitler arrived, the room stiffened. Many of the businessmen had never seen him up close. Some expected a fire-breathing demagogue, others a wild-eyed fanatic. Instead, they were met with the calculated composure of a man who knew exactly what he needed and exactly what he was offering. For an hour and a half, Hitler spoke without notes. He didn't mention tariffs or taxes. Instead, he painted a picture of Germany sliding toward civil war, paralyzed by weak governments, threatened by Bolshevik terror. And then he made the choice brutally simple. Support the Nazis or prepare for chaos. Fund this election or watch your factories fall into the hands of the left. It wasn't a speech. It was an ultimatum wrapped in patriotism. The industrialists had expected a negotiation. Instead, they received a warning. Something in the room shifted. Fear, admiration, pragmatism, no one could say. But as Hitler finished, the message was clear. This was their last chance to choose the future and their own survival. The first to react was Gustav Krupp, patriarch of Germany's oldest industrial dynasty. He had arrived intending to object, to distance himself from the Radical Party. But after Hitler's address, he simply stood up, thanked the Nazi leader, and said nothing more. The resistance evaporated. No one challenged the vision Hitler laid out. And then came Hjalmar Schachte, the brilliant economist, the financial architect of the coming regime, carrying a ledger and a pen. He moved through the room with calm efficiency, approaching each magnate with the same genteel phrase. Now, gentlemen, shall we proceed to the contributions? By the end of the evening, nearly 2 million Reichsmarks had been pledged, an enormous sum. Enough to fund a nationwide propaganda blitz, enough to drown out political opponents, enough to tilt the coming election decisively. Among the largest contributors was IG Farben, the chemical empire that would soon become infamous for its deep collaboration with the Nazi state. Other giants followed. Their signatures sealed more than a donation, they sealed the political fate of Germany. That night, Göring celebrated. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary with unusual glee, "Money is flowing. Now the battle truly begins." And indeed, everything that followed, the election surge, the Reichstag fire, the enabling act, the dismantling of democracy, it traces its roots to that evening. The meeting was secret, but its consequences were not. It was the moment when corporate Germany made its choice. Not with votes, but with cash. The businessmen believed they were buying stability. In reality, they were financing their own undoing and empowering a dictatorship that would consume the world. Factories and camps. Industry at the service of terror. When we talk about Nazi Germany, we often imagine tanks, planes, uniforms, a visible machinery of war. But the true engine of the regime, the one that powered its rise and sustained its brutality, was located far from the front lines. It was inside factories, in boardrooms, behind barbed wire. And many of the men who ran those factories were not soldiers or ideologues. They were businessmen, calculating, ambitious, and ready to exploit anything for profit. The turning point came in 1937, when Heinrich Himmler invited a select group of industrialists on a special visit. They were taken not to a mine or a steel plant, but to the outskirts of Munich, to Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp. The tour was carefully staged. Orderly workshops, silent prisoners, neat inventories. No whips, no beatings, just the appearance of efficient labor at zero cost. The message was unmistakable. We can give you workers as many as you want. For the businessmen present, many representing giants like IG Farben, this wasn't a moral horror. It was an opportunity, and they took it. Within months, industrialists began negotiating directly with SS officers. New facilities appeared next to camps. Contracts were signed to rent prisoners for a daily fee cheaper than any free worker and infinitely replaceable. At Auschwitz, Farben built an entire complex. Monowitz, known to prisoners as Auschwitz-E. It was the first industrial site in history designed around forced labor and mass death. Conditions were engineered not just to extract labor, but to destroy the laborers themselves. Prisoners were forced to run everywhere. Walking was punished. They slept in overcrowded wooden barracks, wore wooden shoes that mangled their feet, and worked 12 to 16 hours a day in freezing temperatures. The average life expectancy of a new arrival assigned to hard labor, 8 to 12 weeks. Executives knew. They visited. They inspected. They saw skeletal workers collapsing at their feet. And still, they expanded. Take Friedrich Flick, one of Germany's wealthiest tycoons. His empire supplied steel, coal, machinery, the raw materials of war. Flick financed the Nazi Party, profited enormously from rearmament, and filled his factories with tens of thousands of prisoners. When the war ended, he was convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to 7 years. He served just 3. And when he walked free, he returned to business and soon became one of the richest men in Europe again. Or IG Farben, or the chemical empire whose labs produced synthetic fuel, rubber, and eventually Zyklon B. More than 35,000 prisoners passed through Monowitz. Nearly all died. Farben executives claimed the SS hid the truth from them, but internal documents tell a different story. Reports on labor inefficiency, complaints about workers collapsing too quickly, requests for fresh labor shipments. Even companies not normally associated with ideology became willing partners. Daimler-Benz used forced labor extensively. BMW used prisoners. Junkers, Siemens, Krupp, nearly every major industrial name built its wartime fortune on the backs of captives. In total, by 1944, over 700,000 enslaved laborers were working in German industry. 1 in every 4 German workers was a prisoner. And the system kept expanding because it was profitable. The SS received money. Companies received labor. The Reich received weapons. And the prisoners received nothing but starvation and violence until their bodies gave out. After the war, many of these men claimed ignorance. We didn't know. We never intended harm. We were just following state directives. But the truth, documented in letters, contracts, and factory memos, reveals something colder. They knew exactly what they were doing. They simply didn't care. The factories of Germany weren't just producing steel and vehicles. They were producing suffering, industrialized, optimized, monetized. And for many corporate leaders, the war wasn't a tragedy. It was the most profitable period of their careers. Some were punished. Many were not. Some served short sentences. Others returned to their companies. A few became wealthy again in the new Federal Republic, their past quietly ignored in the rush to rebuild. What remains is a chilling lesson. The machinery of terror is never built by ideology alone. It needs engineers, accountants, managers, people willing to look away, to justify, to profit. And in Nazi Germany, far too many of them did exactly that. Global connections, Swiss banks, neutral deals, and the shadow economy. As the Second World War expanded, Germany found itself in a paradox. It was waging total war against half the world, yet depended on that same world to keep its economy alive. Blockades, embargoes, and diplomatic isolation should have strangled the Reich. But they didn't. Why? Because behind the front lines, far from the sound of bombs, a silent network of neutral companies and banks helped keep German industry running. Switzerland was at the center of this shadow economy. Officially neutral, it sat like a calm island in the middle of a burning continent. But inside Zurich boardrooms and Basel bank vaults, neutrality became something far more flexible. Swiss bankers handled German gold shipments, including gold looted from occupied nations and, tragically, gold taken from victims inside the camps. They converted it into foreign currency. They moved it across borders. And they did so with a precision that made Switzerland the financial heartbeat of the Nazi war machine. The route was simple. German trains crossed the border carrying sealed crates. Banks inspected them, weighed them, logged them, No questions asked. In return, Germany received credits it could use to purchase crucial imports: oil from Romania, tungsten from Portugal, ball bearings from Sweden. Without this financial alchemy, many of the Reich's military operations would have stalled. But Switzerland wasn't alone. Portugal played a crucial role supplying tungsten, a metal essential for armor-piercing ammunition. The Allies begged Lisbon to stop. Portugal refused. The profits were too high. Ships loaded with or sailed under neutral flags, completing a trade that helped prolong the war. Sweden delivered high-grade iron ore, steel ball bearings, and precision tools. Its exports kept German factories humming. Some Swedish companies even negotiated insurance contracts allowing trains and shipments to pass safely through the war zone. And then there were the corporations, names that still exist today. Maggi, the food giant, operated dual supply chains. Officially, it sold basic goods to civilians. Unofficially, it supplied German military kitchens and profited enormously from wartime trade. Kodak, despite being an American company, maintained European subsidiaries that continued to operate inside Germany. Some of them even used forced labor. Business was segmented in such a way that parent companies could claim ignorance while profits quietly flowed. Other firms, from watchmakers to chemical companies, established double corporations. One registered in Germany, the other in a neutral country. The German branch could trade domestically while the Swiss or Portuguese branch handled foreign deals and financial transfers. This structure allowed them to bypass restrictions, maintain global networks, and protect their assets no matter who won the war. The mechanics were simple, but the consequences were enormous. Through these channels, Nazi Germany bought fuel, alloys, chemicals, machine parts, everything it needed to sustain its military. Even when Allied bombing crippled German factories, raw materials kept arriving through neutral ports, prolonging the fight month after month. What makes this story even more unsettling is the tone found in many surviving letters and contracts. There is no ideology, no fanaticism, no mention of politics. Just business. Companies wrote of market opportunities, wartime efficiency, strategic adjustments. For many executives, the war wasn't a geopolitical catastrophe, it was a profitable expansion. After 1945, the reckoning was slow and incomplete. Some banks denied involvement. Some companies destroyed documents. Others quietly negotiated settlements decades later. A few admitted nothing at all. But the deeper question remains. How many lives were lost because trade routes stayed open? How many battles lasted longer because shipments kept arriving? How many companies built their modern empires on profits earned during humanity's darkest hour? The story of the Third Reich is often told through the lens of tanks, dictators, and armies. But the truth is broader and more uncomfortable. Behind the front lines, in quiet offices and polished bank lobbies, another kind of partnership was formed. A partnership not driven by ideology, but by profit. A global network where neutrality became an illusion, and where the world's largest corporations played their part in keeping a war machine alive. Legacy and responsibility. Who truly wrote history? When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Cities were reduced to ash, millions were dead, and the world was confronted with a scale of cruelty it had never seen before. The death camps, the factories of exploitation, the archives all revealed a truth so dark that even hardened soldiers struggled to comprehend it. But as the world rushed to judge the leaders of the Nazi regime, one question lingered like smoke above the ruins. Who else made this possible? Who financed the machine? Who kept its heart beating? Who turned ideology into industry and industry into terror? The Nuremberg trials attempted to answer this. For the first time in history, businessmen sat in the defendant's dock alongside political and military figures. The Flick trial, the Krupp trial, the Farben trial, these cases exposed the deep partnership between corporate power and state violence. Executives were confronted with documents showing their signatures on forced labor requisitions, ledgers showing profits from slave labor, correspondence revealing negotiations for worker deliveries. And yet, many of them maintained the same defense, endlessly repeated. We did not know. We had no choice. We only followed economic necessity. But the court records told a different story. Friedrich Flick, who built his empire on stolen factories and enslaved prisoners, was sentenced to 7 years. He served just 3. Within a decade, he was one of the richest men in West Germany. Alfred Krupp, heir to a dynasty that armed Germany for both world wars, received 12 years. He served 3. His property was restored. He returned to business as if nothing had happened. IG Farben was dissolved, but not destroyed. Its successor companies BASF, Bayer, Hoechsta quickly regained their position as world leaders in chemistry and pharmaceuticals. Justice was rendered but only partially. The moral debt was far greater than the legal sentences. Why? Because post-war Europe needed to rebuild quickly, and these industrialists had the skills, factories, and resources to do it. The Cold War was beginning, and the West wanted a strong Germany as a buffer against the Soviet Union. Punishing corporate leaders to harshly risk destabilizing an economy the Allies now needed to revive. And so, responsibility blurred. Judgment softened. History, once sharp and unforgiving, became negotiable. But the deeper question remains, the one that echoes through every decade since the war. Could the Nazi regime have risen without the support of the world's richest businessmen? Would Hitler have gained power without their donations? Would the camps have escalated into industrial extermination without corporate engineering? Would the war have lasted as long without neutral nations enabling trade routes and financial transfers? The answer is uncomfortable but unmistakable. Political monsters do not act alone. They require architects, suppliers, financiers, optimizers. They require systems built by ordinary, educated, respectable people. This is the legacy we inherit. When we study the Third Reich, we can't stop at ideology. We must also look at the machinery that sustained it and the hands that kept that machinery running. Not all of those hands were raised in salute. Some held pens. Some counted profits. Some signed contracts in quiet offices far from the battlefield. History is not written only by generals and dictators. It is written by boardrooms, banks, and corporations just as much as by armies. And that leads us to the final, haunting question, the one that defines the moral weight of this entire story. When evil becomes profitable, who will choose to resist it? The legacy of the Nazi era forces us to confront this truth. The line between moral responsibility and self-interest is thin, fragile, and terrifyingly easy to cross. And when future generations look back at our world, our corporations, our governments, our choices, they may ask the same questions we now ask of those who lived through the darkest chapter of the 20th century. Who stood by? Who resisted? And who quietly helped write history from the shadows?